lecture series. Just a few notes. One is, please RSVP to let us know you're coming so that we know how many meals to order. I guess we normally order a few extra, but even this time we ran short. So if you let us know that you're coming, then we know how many to have. And that'll help us out a lot. But we, of course, appreciate all of you showing up and participating in the lecture series. And I just want to remind you that if you have any ideas for lectures that we should be having in the future, please pass them along, and we'll see if we can't add them to our list of future lectures. Okay? Also, let me quickly put up what was on the web up on the screen here. This is our website, which can be found at uaedreform.org. If you go there, it will take you to our front page, which looks like this. That's our front page. And if you want to see about the lectures, you can just click here or on this big thing here. And then you can see the list of lectures, who's coming, the dates. Lectures, unless otherwise noted, will be at noon on Fridays. And the titles, as we get them, we add them in. Some people don't quite have titles made for some of their lectures yet, but as we have them, we'll get them up here as well. And so this gives you a feeling for what we have coming up. And also, if you want to see old lectures, since we video them and we put them up on the web, and you can find old lectures by going here. For example, you could see last week's, or you could see them from prior years by clicking on here. Okay? So you don't even have to come, but of course, if you do come, you get a delicious lunch at our wonderful company.
If we don't come, will you send the lunch to us?
We're working on that. You know, it's some sort of state law financial accounting issue or something. I'm sure that there's a regulation that covers that. So anyway, with those preliminaries out of the way, let me introduce Julie Cullen, our speaker for today. Julie is a professor at University of California, San Diego in the Department of Economics. She received her training, both undergraduate and graduate, at Stanford in economics, and was previously a professor at Michigan. MIT? PhD MIT. Oops, my bad. And also has significant interest in health as well as education. Was a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow, right? Yeah. Okay. And so she embodies our college, both interest in education and health. And so today, she was going to talk about merit pay and principles, but that got pushed aside. Instead, we're going to hear from Julie about the efforts that have been made in Texas to address desegregation in higher education and some of the effects that may have on what people are doing in their K-12 schooling as well. Okay? So, Julie Cullen.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me out. This paper, the work I'm going to talk about is a little bit dense, so please stop me if there's some clarifying questions as we go through it. The issue that I'm looking at is a specific reform in in Texas that was the top 10% policy, which was introduced guaranteeing students in high school in the top 10% of their school access to any one of the higher education institutions in Texas. And what we're looking at is one of the unintended consequences of this policy, which is since this bases access decisions on relative position within a class.
Could you just speak a little louder? Some of the people.
Okay. So since this policy gives access based on relative position compared to other students in the same school, this gives students an incentive, or it now makes schools with relatively lower achieving peers relatively more attractive than they would be before. And that's the basic question we're addressing in this work is, to what extent do we see students trading down? And so in what ways has this policy that's really aimed at higher education institutions, has it led to some form of destratification at the elementary and secondary level? It was definitely there are many other direct effects of this policy, and this is one of, I think, the interesting unintended consequences. And so before I get into this side issue, I want to start with what the policy was intended to do in the first place. And so this policy followed a controversy in affirmative action at the public institutions in Texas as well as other states in the U.S. And following a 1996 decision, affirmative action was banned in universities in Texas. And the decision at that point said that you cannot use race-based preferences to undo discrimination other than that done by the institution itself. Okay, so it can't fix social wrongs. It has to fix wrongs done only by the institution. Following that, Texas banned race-based admissions in all of its campuses. And so there was a period between that 1996 decision and a recent wave of Supreme Court decisions in 2004 that have now basically introduced a new policy that says there can in fact be affirmative action, but it has to be non-formulaic affirmative action. Okay, so it can't be something that's explicit. It can be implicit affirmative action. But between those two time periods, other states, just like Texas, eliminated these race-based policies. So Texas was the first to do so in 1997. There was, in the brief year following the elimination of affirmative action, a drop-off in minority matriculation at the institutions in Texas. And so in 1997, then Governor Bush pushed through this top 10% law with the goal of trying to restore minority representation at the flagships in Texas. And so this policy, the reason that it would hope it would replace something like race-based admissions is that it can, at least geographically, equalize access to school and also across schools of different quality levels. So if the top 10% in any given school is guaranteed access, that means that if it were a perfectly segregated system, minorities and whites would have completely equal access to the higher education system. The problem in practice is that schools aren't that segregated. And so it's not really a very effective means, as it turns out, to restore minority access at these public institutions. So not the problem, that was a horrible thing to say, but the problem for this policy working. And so but that was the direct intention of this policy. And so this unintended consequence that we're looking at is the fact that now it matters who you're with your peers for this particular price, which is guaranteed access to the Texas public school system. And so we'd like to know, do we see students trading down? And that may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing. And the extent to which you might think it's a bad thing is that if it's more advantaged students choosing alternative high schools than they otherwise would have, crowding out less advantaged students, then it is skewing access of this, really, it's a redistributive policy toward more advantaged students. It may have positive spillovers if it actually leads to higher ability students attending schools with lower achieving peers, and there's positive spillovers to those students. So I think it has, this behavior that we're going to look at has ambiguous welfare implications, and what we're trying to do is just document the extent to which this actually happens. So do we see students changing their high school choice in response to the policy? And I think the broader implications of this is if we attach any kind of reward to the local context, and that's what this policy does, then if we find a response here, it suggests that students' decisions over which school to attend will be very sensitive to those kinds of rewards. Okay, so we can generalize from this example. And so just to give you a little bit more background on the policy in Texas, it is a very strong policy. So there are other states, California and Florida, have what are known as top X% plans. They're not nearly as powerful as Texas is. Texas guarantees admission to any one of the public universities, all of them actually, I should say. So if you're in the top 10% of your class, you're automatically guaranteed admission to UT Austin, Texas A&M. And it's includes public schools, private schools, as long as students apply to college within 2 years after graduating. And for Texas public school students, the Texas higher education institutions are one of the most common higher education choices. Only about 25% of high school students go on to four-year colleges, but among those that do, 2/3 choose Texas public higher education institutions. And so that's where we come up with this background figure of about 1 in 6 students should find this option of guaranteed admission appealing. That's about the fraction that chooses to attend these institutions. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this in words, but what I'm trying to do is just lay out enough of a framework to explain what we think the effect of this policy is going to be in this dimension and who the students are who are most likely to change their behavior based on the new policy. And so what we're assuming is we're going to be looking, given the data that we have, at students who have already made 8th grade choices. So they're in 8th grade, and we're looking at the high schools that they choose for 10th grade. And so thinking about children and their parents making these decisions, among the things they care about, surely the neighborhood characteristics that are associated with the schools, tuition if it's a private school, distance, if they're not going to move residences, how far it is to travel to that school. So there are a whole set of things that will play into parent and child preferences. But one of the things that is going to be important from the perspective of this policy is the potential future outcomes for the child. And there'd be direct effects from the quality of the school, so how high achieving or what the value added is of the school, indirect effects through the access that it grants to higher education institutions. And so if you think about families ranking schools before this policy, and then the policy comes into place, those schools that offer the student a top 10% opportunity, so where that student has a chance of being in the top 10%, are the only ones that directly become relatively more attractive. Right? All of the other schools have basically the same features that they had before, but there's now every single one of these institutions offering guaranteed access to Texas higher education institutions becomes relatively more attractive. And so what our main prediction is that we should see students being more likely to choose these schools, and what that must mean is that they're going to be trading down in peer quality. Okay, so that we're going to see, as a result of this policy, the only schools that become relatively more attractive are ones offering these top 10% opportunities. We should see students more likely to choose these. And so we're going to see, if anything, students trading down in terms of quality of the schools that they attend. Okay, so for which students is it going to be important? It's going to be important for students who are interested in attending a public higher education institution, so they're very likely to apply, and particularly important if they're likely to apply and have a high chance of being rejected. Okay, so if you think of an unconditional rejection likelihood as saying how important this policy is, so let's say I had a 40% chance of both applying to and being rejected. Now if I look at a school that guarantees me access, that takes my chances from 40% up to 100%.
Just to clarify, what are people's chances of getting into UT Austin if they're not in the top 10%? Are they awful? Or does it depend? What is that?
They're very good for the top 10%. So most students in the top 10% statewide would get into Texas. We'll get them for sure. No, I meant top 10% statewide, not within their local context.
Okay.
So if you rank students by ability, by the time you get down to about the 60th percentile in the state, the chances of getting in if you apply are about half. So they decline almost monotonically with test scores. At the top end, though, their chances of getting in are very high. But that's something to keep in mind, is you both have to want this option and have a chance that you may not have this option. And so we're going to try to see if there's greater responsiveness among these kinds of students. Okay, so our key predictions are that this kind of trading down behavior as you introduce this policy, and just think of it as changing parents' rankings of schools, should lead to a convergence in thresholds. And by thresholds, we just mean if you could somehow classify the achievement of students, and in reality it would be GPA. And so imagine you have students ranked, and you'd have a level of achievement you'd have to obtain to be in the top 10% in that school. Okay, then we're thinking of the threshold as like how able would you have to be in order to be in the top 10% of the school. And so we'd expect to see those thresholds converging across schools as individuals are trading down. Okay, because someone who's trading down is going to be obviously moving into the top 10% at the school they're moving to and raising the threshold at that school. And so we'd expect to see thresholds converging. And what's going to determine how likely students are to change their high school choices is, one, we've just discussed motive, so they have to value this opportunity. And two, they have to have schools nearby that they can choose. Right? So it's not likely to be a strong enough incentive to actually move residents to take advantage of this opportunity. Did you have a question? Okay. Yeah, it looks like you did. You could.
I'll ask this question. He said all high schools take part in this, even private and
public.
They all do across the board.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Oh, so that another issue related to that is that the high schools themselves determine who the top 10% is. And so the way classes are weighted, how GPA is determined, is a school-specific thing. And students transferring into a school very late in the game could be excluded from the top 10%. Okay, so the school gets to decide. Okay, so the different strategies that we're going to do is I'm going to first show you some results from pre-post analyses. We're just going to look at the time series and ask questions like, do we see thresholds at schools converge? And then I'm going to look specifically at the transitions of students between 8th and 10th grades and see if they're changing their high school attendance patterns. Okay, the data that we're using are individual level test score data. And this will give you a sense of what's the data are facilitating this approach that we do, but it also greatly limits what we can do. Okay, so the data that we're using are individual test score data. And students in Texas, during the period that we're looking at, were tested in grades 3 through 8 and 10. And so what we're seeing are what are called test score documents. And everyone submits a test score document regardless of whether they take the test or not. So you can think of it as like a census of students in these grades. And so we observe the census of students in 8th grade. We observe the census in 10th grade. And these censuses include individual student IDs. And so that's why we're looking at the 8th to 10th grade transition, is we can see students in 8th grade when they show up in these test score documents, and then we're looking to see where those same students show up in 10th grade. Okay, so we observe some of their background variables, we observe their test scores, we observe the middle schools that they're attending, and then in 10th grade we observe the high schools that they're attending. Okay, but those are basically the data that we're using to look at these kinds of high school choices. And so our strategy, the key identification strategies, we're going to be using 6 different cohorts. And this is the years that these students are in 8th grade. So the 8th graders that are in school from 1992-93 through 1997-98. And so all of these students effectively made their high school choices before the top 10% policy was introduced. Okay, that's not literally true about this group, because the policy was announced in the spring of 1997, and it was effective for the students who then graduated in 1998. And so for the 10th graders, we're treating this as a treatment cohort. For 8th graders, the incentive to change in middle schools in response to this policy isn't very great. So we're assuming that all of these cohorts chose the high schools they otherwise would have if the policy weren't in place. And then we're looking in the post period after the policy is implemented. We have 3 of these cohorts choosing their 8th grade high schools before the top 10% policy is there, 3 of them choosing after the top 10% policy is in place. And so what we're basically going to be assuming is we're using these early cohorts to establish which high schools different 8th grade classes feed, which types of students attend each of the high schools in an area, and then as do we see the patterns change afterward in the directions we'd expect. Oops. Yeah?
What is the mechanism by which they choose? Do they have free choice, or is it residential mobility?
So there's not free choice. But most of the urban districts in Texas have intra-district choice, so there's magnet programs, there's informal choice, and then there is also a cross-district choice program that exists, but it's not used that often. And so what we're actually going to do is I'm going to show you some results that break it down by how easy the choices are. We don't pick up anything if you're thinking of it as people moving. Where we see a lot of action is where people have ready alternatives within the same district. Like, for example, the district I live in, this is in California, but there's no explicit choice. But there's a lot of implicit choice. My kids are in a school other than the assigned school. And so it looks like it's pretty free within districts, not so free across district lines. But that raises I should qualify what we're calling choice is obviously constrained choice, is the schools have to be willing to allow these students to make these changes. Okay, so what do we need to get this analysis off the ground is we basically want to be able to take students and determine whether or not they would be in the top 10% in any of the schools that they might attend. Right, we want to figure out which schools are likely to offer children top 10% opportunities. If we just had a single test score, I would just rank students statewide on that test score. See where the what percentile they fall in that distribution. I'd look at each school, look at the 10th graders who end up at those schools, and see how their distribution compares to where that student places statewide, and tell whether or not they'd be in the top 10%. We happen to have 2 test scores that are detailed test scores, which are reading and math. And so we do an initial analysis to combine the reading and math test scores. And all we do is we weight those, and we're weighting math relatively higher because in an alternative data set we find that that's more predictive of class rank. Okay, and we actually, with these test score data, or with these achievement test scores, we're able to explain a fairly high percentage of class rank within high schools. Because we're using 8th grade test scores, and we can explain almost 40% of the variation in class rank within high schools. So it's not ideal. You know, I would ideally like to have measures of GPA, but we have standardized test scores, and we use those to place students relative to their peers across the state and within schools. Okay, so this, once we have students labeled, we can then label each of the schools. And so if in any given cohort we can tell what percentile that student falls statewide, when we know which students attend each school, the way that we label schools was we identify at what percentile the top 10% student lies in that school. And so that's what we're defining as a threshold in each school. And so that's going to be our key dependent variable, is where in the achievement distribution statewide is the top 10% within a given school. And for some of the analysis, we're going to hold that fixed at the beginning of time and not let that evolve over the period. And that's to try to avoid introducing some of the other changes that happened over the same time in Texas. Okay, so we've talked about the opportunity, where the opportunity is finding whether or not students have a top 10% opportunity at different schools. The motivation, again, is whether they're likely to apply to and be rejected by one of these institutions. And so we're not going to do anything parametric with the motivation that students have. But we just want to show you where you might expect to see students responding. So where in the state distribution are students likely to respond to this change in ranking of schools due to the top 10% policy? And so what these are showing is the very top line. The first and third line are measured off of the left axis. The other two are on the right axis. What they're showing is application and rejection. And what they're broken down by is the statewide ability decile measure. Okay, so our ability measure for the students. And what it's showing is that if you're looking at applications to either any competitive school or a competitive school within the state, those are rising monotonically with ability. Okay, so it's the higher achieving kids who are interested in these options, not surprisingly. If you look at rejection, unconditional and applying, so just acting, that's a combination of both applying and being rejected. If we're looking at any public institution, that's this line right here, this one right here, that one continues to rise monotonically with ability. So it's true that high ability students who apply are less likely to be rejected conditional on applying, but they're enough more likely to apply that they're also more likely to be rejected than a lower ability student, unconditionally, not conditioning on application. If we look at the bottom line there, that's showing the unconditional likelihood of being rejected at a public competitive college. And there we see a peak around the third decile. Okay, so the very highest students are more likely to apply, but not enough more likely that we actually see it somewhere a little bit further down in the distribution, that students might have the greatest incentive to alter their high school plans. Okay, but we're agnostic about where you'd expect to see the responses. It's hard to get inside children's and parents' heads and say who really values this option the most. Okay, but this is to give you a sense that it's going to be students higher up in the ability distribution, and it could potentially be peaks somewhere less than at the highest ability students. Okay, so this is just the first sort of time series, the pre-post analysis to ask, given we had this prediction that we'd expect to see thresholds converge, okay, we'd actually expect to see thresholds rise as students are trading down, as higher ability students are attending lower achieving campuses. And this is certainly not going to be proof that this is what's going on. We're just asking, are the overall data consistent with the story that we're telling? And so what these are showing by year is across the high school campuses where students would have to be in the statewide achievement distribution to be in the top 10% at the campus. And so you can see that these are rising over time. If we look from the pre to the post policy years, it increases by about half a percentage point. Okay, so it goes from the what is about the 88th percentile to 88.0 to 88.4. And it's the standard deviation of these thresholds, if you look all the way across campuses, is about 8 percentile points. Okay, so there's some evidence that thresholds are rising. And another prediction is that we'd expect to see the composition of students in the top 10% of their high school class are going to be coming from students higher up in the statewide ability distribution. Because we have higher achieving students when they move to other schools are going to be displacing students who are lower achieving from the top 10%. And this is evidence that that was happening as well. And so what the bars are showing is the fraction of students in the top 10% of their class that are from the top 10% statewide. And so that went up. As you can see, the pre-post are the last two bars from before to after the policy. What the circles are showing is the same thing, the fraction of students in the top 10% of their class that are from the third decile, okay, between the 70th and 80th percentile statewide. And that, you can see that the increased representation of more able students came almost completely at the expense of students between the 70th and 80th percentile. Okay, so we do see a shift towards more able students being in the top 10%, more able statewide, in the top 10% of their high school classes. Of course, this is very far removed from the kind of mobility that we're interested in looking at, but just consistent with that. And so what we're going to do, I'll spare you the nitty-gritty details, but I'll just verbally explain what we're going to look at to try to get a first impact of whether or not this mobility is going on. Is we're going to take schools, and as I've said, we've labeled each school with a threshold for getting into the top 10% at the school. We're going to hold those fixed at the beginning. Okay, so the first time we see the campus, we have the threshold, and that threshold's fixed. So those aren't changing over time. And then what we're doing is we're going to be comparing students from the same middle schools, the same decile of the statewide ability distribution, over time. And we're asking across the statewide ability distribution, are students more likely to be attending schools with lower thresholds. Okay, so remember the thresholds aren't time varying. So we're just asking, are they going to schools or attending schools that have lower thresholds? And the comparison group is students from the same 8th grade campus, same ability decile, before and after the reform. Okay, and so the groups that we're going to look at, and this is where we're first narrowing down to say, where do we see this action happening? So is it people moving? Or is it choosing alternative schools that are actually relatively not very costly to choose? Okay, where choosing an alternative is not very costly. And so the way we're going to do that is we're looking first at students who are in middle schools where there are multiple schools within 10 miles. So that'll be one sample restriction, just saying, do you at least have schooling options that are nearby? And you can see what these are showing is they're broken down by decile. We're just looking at the top 5 statewide ability deciles. Okay, but this is going to be the 5th, and this is going to be the top decile. This is showing the fraction of students that have these, that live in these kinds of districts. Okay, and so many, it's almost 90%, so 85% of students have more than one school within 10 miles. And in each case, what the second group of bars are showing is within that sample, where they have more than one school within 10 miles, what fraction could find a school where they could be in the top 10%. Okay, so it's giving you a sense of whether or not they could even have an incentive to change schooling options. And not surprisingly, the high ability students can find top 10% opportunities, and it's much less likely that the low ability students can. Okay, so it's just monotonic with respect to ability.
And that's because the lower achieving students, the schools that are nearby also stink, right? Is that what that is?
You mean why any of them would be able to get into the top 10%?
No, they have fewer opportunities to switch to a...
So it's not even switching.
Okay.
It's not even switching. It's looking at the set of schools within 10 miles
Right.
and saying, is there a school where they could be in the top 10%? And this says for only a very small fractions, for about 5% of students between the 50th and 60th decile, could they find
That's
such a school?
The schools that are within 10 miles are also...
No, it's because they're too good.
They're too good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so too good. There aren't schools that are bad enough for them to place in the top 10%. I shouldn't say bad enough, because they could be really good schools, but low achieving enough. And so this is just a sample split by having multiple schools within 10 miles. These next two are the same kind of figures for multiple schools within the same district as the middle school. And you see about half of the sample fits into this category. And we see the same pattern that obviously higher ability students are more likely to have a top 10% option within that set of schools. And then the final one is looking at cases where alternative high school choices would be especially easy, where there's a middle school that feeds multiple high schools. Okay, so there's already established feeder patterns for many high schools from the same middle school. And that covers about a third of our sample. And again, very skewed options by where you are in the ability distribution. Okay, so I'm going to skip this table and just show you the graphical results. So to explain what these are measuring the change from before to after, where the ones that are not colored, so the empty circles, are showing you the change in the threshold at the high school children attend from before to after. And those are just showing the average effect, the ones that has the open hole. And it shouldn't be surprising that given that we've held the thresholds fixed, there's not a lot going on there. Right? So on average, we don't see that children are attending schools with any higher or lower threshold. Remember, they're held fixed. So there's not a lot of just secular mobility across schools. What the blue dots are showing is, well, what about the differential effect for students in these ability deciles that have top 10% opportunities within this set? So in the first case, we're looking at all those students who have multiple high schools within 10 miles. And so what you can see is that students who had the potential, so there was within this set a school where they could find a top 10% opportunity, that's where we see this trading down. And so I should explain what these, this is looking at the effect among students in the 5th decile statewide, those two dots. This is 4th, 3rd, and this is up to the top decile. Because if we see that number fall below 0, it says that the threshold at the schools attended by these students are lower. So they're choosing schools, I should say, with lower initial thresholds, so they're trading down. And so we're seeing trading down behavior, not on average, but among students that have, which shouldn't be surprising. It's only if I have an opportunity that we should be seeing any systematic changes in the types of schools that students are choosing. So there's no secular trend towards attending initially lower quality schools. Okay, but there is among those who can find a top 10% opportunity within that set. And so the next two figures that I'm going to show you have the exact same structure. They're just changing the sample restriction a little bit. Okay, so this is for those students who have multiple high schools within a district. And so here you can see there's more. I should have said those bars are showing you the standard errors. Okay, so we're picking up statistically significant trading down, not at the very top in this case, but in the second, third, and fourth deciles. And so in a minute I'm going to come back to why these are a little bit hard to interpret. But this is clearly evidence that there are changes in the school attendance patterns among students in these deciles if they had an incentive to change their behavior. Okay, so we are seeing some trading down. The reason I'm not showing the other deciles is if you go from decile 6 up to 10, you can't find students that have top 10% opportunities. Okay, so they don't have an incentive to move. Not that they might well apply to and get rejected from college. They just can't find a high school where they can be in the top 10%. Okay, and this is the last one that's looking at those students in those middle schools that feed multiple high schools. And so here's where you see, and here it's at the 7th, what's that going to be? 60th to 70th, where we see really strong evidence of trading down. And only very small fraction of these students fall into that category, where they can find a school. But those that can seem to act pretty aggressively on that. And so I want to stop here to say why these are hard to interpret, because I'm going to talk about where we're heading next with this research, is that the size of the effect, so I can say there's a stronger response or a bigger change in thresholds for students in this decile. But what I can't tell you is whether it's more students choosing alternative schools compared to where they would have attended prior to the policy, or whether it's a few students really trading down, going to schools that have very, very low quality to guarantee themselves access to one of the public universities. And so that's why we're moving on to do a more structural analysis from here, so we can actually simulate how do students' schooling choices change from before to after the reform. Okay, but so far there's pretty strong evidence that when choice is easy, that students are changing their schooling decisions in response to this policy. We've done a little bit of analysis splitting it up by minority status, by poverty status, and though the patterns according to which ability deciles are responding the most, so whether it's more able students or middling able students, vary across race, ethnicities, and poverty status, we're seeing responsiveness across across these subcategories. And it has that same kind of confusion overlaid, where we often find stronger responsiveness among minority students and poor students. And I think that's because in order to find top 10% placements, they probably have to sacrifice a lot in terms of peer quality or peer achievement. Okay, so what we're working on now is, given that we found that the district seems to be at least most people have more than one school in the district, so half of the students in Texas fall into this sample where they have more than one choice within the same school. And so we want to zero in on that group. And we found that the incentive to cross district boundaries looks like it's relatively muted. So most of the action is happening within the very same district. Okay, and that's where we believe that parents can exercise this kind of choice relatively freely. So now what we're going to do is we're taking, there's about 1,000 districts in Texas. We're going to treat each one of those like a separate market. And so within that market, there's going to be a set of schools that students can choose. We can characterize those schools. They have properties from the perspective of the students, like distance from not home, but where their 8th grade campus was. So there's distance measures, peer quality measures. So what's the median achievement at the school, whether or not it's the school that most students in their middle school attend. So we can come up with all these characteristics of schools and see how those explain school choice decisions, where the key variable that we're interested in is, does that school offer the student a top 10% opportunity, and is it before or after the policy? And so I think the most interesting thing that can come out of that is we can start quantifying like how many bodies are behind the patterns that we're finding in the threshold analysis, and the extent to which it's coming from crowd out across races, or whether it's crowd out purely along the lines of ability, which is what it appears to be so far.
Let me start. Thanks a lot. Let me start off with a business proposal that Bob has suggested, and then a question. The business proposal is: it seems like we should go into business in Texas, opening up private schools that offer 10% opportunities.
We need to buy 9 people.
Well, we can take the tuition and pay 9 other people to sign up, and apparently it could be, we get to decide how we do it, so we could do it at the very end of high school. You know, in the last month, transfer into our school. And I imagine homeschoolers, to make this, you know, might have this issue, I suppose.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know how homeschoolers are treated.
But actually, my question was about besides going into business, was that oddly the purpose of this program was to improve racial and ethnic desegregation in higher education. But paradoxically, it depends upon racial and ethnic segregation in K-12. Okay, and the extent to which this policy could help contribute to desegregation in higher ed depends upon the continuation of segregation in K-12. So, is there evidence, I know this is outside of your analysis, but since you've been following this policy and looking at it, is there any indication that somehow this undermines desegregation efforts in K-12?
So based on our analysis and what I've seen from application analysis, matriculation analysis, it does not look like these kinds of responses and application responses are undermining minority access. So that segregation does not seem to be affected. It does seem like more able students are crowding out less able students. And so it depends on what your policy perspective is on that. So what this broadly did, if you look at the big changes in enrollment at UT Austin and Texas A&M in response to this policy, is an urban to rural shift. Okay, that it's brought in a lot of rural schools that had not sent students to these UT systems before. And so it depends on the degree of academic preparation, but it's really been more of a geographic redistribution than a redistribution across race. And I think our findings, like the specific mechanism we're looking at, which is students changing school choice, appears to be, and this is based on a preliminary analysis, happening. It's not that students are choosing schools that are different racially than the schools that they are initially in. And so that to the extent it's crowd out, it seems to be within race ethnicities. So it's more of an ability deep stratification.
Do you have a chart that shows, before all of this began, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, what the top 10% of ability students were doing in Texas before this policy, in the context of affirmative action, was across racial groups? So we know where the high ability students, how many of them were going to these Texas universities, and now where it is at this point. So we can just see whether...
Yeah, I can tell you what I know about that, which is among white students, top 10% students, so within their class, are no more or less likely to apply to UT Austin than they were before.
Oh, this is Austin, but what about...
Or the flagships, I should say.
All of this university?
All of, well, so the reason I'm focusing on the flagships is that there aren't very many universities where students would have had to worry about getting in. So that there is another set. There's a handful of other universities where admission is not open. But many of the public universities, you wouldn't worry about being rejected before this.
So students could go, any kind of student could go to some university because of open admission policies or something.
Yeah. So the real impact was on the flagships.
Which are what, 4 or 5?
Just UT Austin and Texas A&M.
Just 2?
But they serve, I told you that the fraction that go on to four-year colleges, among those in the top 10%, UT Austin, so these top 10% students, almost all of them, so it's for sure the majority, are going to UT Austin and Texas A&M. And so even though there are many more institutions in Texas, these are the ones that are selective.
If you're not in the top 10%, you won't get into UT Austin or Texas A&M as a freshman. Or if you're an in-state student, you have to be in the top 10%.
So that's true now. So when this policy was first implemented,
it was true in the year 2000.
Yeah, but back in 1997, it was something like 40%.
Okay.
Of UT Austin's body was in the top 10% of their high school class. It's now 80%. Yeah. And so there's been a backlash against this policy among more advantaged suburban students who are attending very high quality schools aren't in the top 10%.
What about the scholarship they give about valedictorian? Have you looked at that from every school?
Oh, I haven't heard about that program. I've heard about scholarships that are targeted to...
If you're the valedictorian, you can get your way paid in any state college.
Is that true? Has that been in...
That's been in effect several years, 5 or 6.
Yeah, so unfortunately in our data, it's not precise enough to identify who that is. But that's interesting, I didn't know that.
But how does that top 10% compare to the
Oh, so yeah, what I was going to tell you,
wanted
sorry,
get-
I left you off on that.
Yeah, the top ability level, which we should be able to get from the task force. In other words,
So that-
forget
this-
the top 10%, let's get to the top ability level in Texas according to these tests before and after this policy across groups.
Are students doing better on the test?
Okay,
Well,
so-
are you getting the highest test score takers?
Okay, so this
That's
is, but that is my measure of ability, is test scores. And the reason that I can't do what I think you're trying to ask is, was there an absolute improvement in ability, is over this period, there was what was called the Texas Miracle. And this happens in every state when a new test is introduced. Right, there's this dramatic improvement. So across the board, there was dramatic improvement in performance. And so what we're doing is we're doing percentile ranks within each year.
Oh,
And so unfortunately, we can't get at the,
can't use a stable measure then.
right, right, unfortunately.
Ah.
Has there been any political gerrymandering that you're aware of to change district boundaries? And as a result of that, any additional resources going into educational institutions that did not have the transferring students before?
So the cases that I've heard of are where districts will host, so some of these magnet programs have come under fire. So no one wants to host the gifted magnet program anymore because they say there goes the top 10%. And so for those types of things where you have kind of concentrations of people outside the local area, there's definitely been local rebellions against those. But as far as changes in district boundaries, I haven't heard much about that. I think one of the areas that'd be particularly interesting would be the charter school movement. But again, my first instinct was sort of along yours, where you could start a business, and then you have to remember it's one who gains for every 9 who lose. And so starting a lot of small schools doesn't really help unless you can convince other people to come along.
I have a really very basic question. To what extent do these kids and their families have access to the information as to what scores are going to get them in the top 10% of these schools?
So there's a really good survey done by the Texas Higher Education Board, where they ask students that. So starting back in middle school, what's your class rank? What's your GPA? Do you know about the top 10% policy? What does it do? And it is true that students, if you look on average, students aren't very well aware of their rank. So there's a lot of noise, but they're enough aware. So particularly the ones who are likely to fall in the top 10% seem much more aware than the students who aren't. And that could be an effect of counselors maybe. But it's, I mean, that's a legitimate issue, and it's not universally true that students are aware of the program.
Julie, I want to sort of follow up on Jay's point. I mean, in a sense, this sounds like a story, one of those rare stories of potentially positive unintended consequences. I mean, the main justification for the initiative was to better integrate institutions of higher ed in Texas racially. And the incentive system that drives it is now causing higher ability students to scatter, not cluster in a small number of elite schools, but at least at the margin, to better integrate high schools in terms of ability. And so from an equity standpoint, you know, that's probably good in and of itself as a second order effect. And there may, I mean, if you believe in peer effects, which I think just about everybody does to some degree, there may even be positive third order effects on the kids who don't make the top 10%, because the top 10% in their school, you know, if they were in a lower performing school, the top 10% in their school is comprised of better peers now than just before. So they may actually be learning more. There may be, this may generate a real compression in terms of student performance statewide, at least to some degree.
Yeah, so that was the positive consequence. So what we can't do in our analysis is balance these out. Because we can't get at long-term effects of having higher achieving peers in your school as compared to being in the top 10%. But I agree. So to me, that's the most interesting thing, is this desegregation. But I should say that before you think, wow, this is the really major effect on student outcomes is going to be this destratification, is what I think the big effect was. As I've told you, it's gone from mainly urban areas feeding these flagships that has now become many more rural schools, is those rural schools have become college-oriented. And so I think that's probably the first order effect on school quality that I shouldn't ignore, because I think that for sure that would dominate the kind of mobility effect that we're looking at.
But I'm sorry, just to follow up, but it actually, I think, if I heard Julie correctly earlier, is that it helps desegregate the high schools by ability, but not by race.
So I'm saying that tentatively.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And if the purpose is to improve racial integration in higher ed, it depends upon the continuation of racial segregation in the K-12 schools, which would provide disincentives, for example, to minority students, high-achieving minority students, to move into schools that had higher-achieving white students. Right? So it would preserve residential and high school segregation. It would entrench that over time. Right? So it actually does, it undermines the exact purpose of deseg just at a lower level. It just does it at the K-12 level.
But I think it's if you're assuming that across groups you have different ability distributions. Right? If everyone from every group was, if the ability distribution across minority and non-minority students was the same, I don't think you can make that argument.
Right, although,
but as long as you're saying they're systematic.
In Texas,
No, you're right. You're right.
The mean point for different ethnic and racial groups is not identical.
Right. So driven by that.
Right.
Then you'd. But so it's still working through kind of the same ability argument, just happens to be correlated with race. Yeah.
Right.
I want to work with Jay on this business proposal. I think we should call it the Lake Wobegon School District. All the children are way above average.
The way it works is this. You've got a public high school there with a lot of AP courses and so on and so forth. I open up a private school that doesn't offer any of that stuff. So I'm drawing from the bottom half of the class, okay? And if most of you are paying tuition and you're not going to, get any advantage out of it, because you weren't going to be top 10 previously, you're not going to be top 10, but 10th of you.
Yeah, it does improve.
And it could be a lottery.
My serious question is this, that you've done an impressive job here. I think anyone who uses the Sigma symbol on 5 PowerPoint images is to be congratulated. But
you obviously don't attend economics.
But if you're tracking these students as you seem to be able to do, you could probably identify some kids who have moved, and you're thinking that they moved because of this. They were motivated to go into a second-tier school. Have you asked them? Have you actually called them?
Other data.
Yeah, not in my data. Yeah,
well, because it does. I mean, I do think that there could be a little bit of causation correlation criticism here. That it does look like you've seen something very interesting. Now I'd like to know whether you've seen what you think you're seeing. So
so I don't have the capabilities to get, meaning the skill either. But there's that group that I was telling you about who did the surveys of students in Texas, and they are asking them those kinds of questions. So how have you changed your behavior in response to the program? And there are a few that suggest that they're doing these kinds of things. That they're choosing, making different choices than they otherwise would have. But we should get that in the paper to give some texture to the stuff that we're looking at, yeah.
Well, to follow up on that, how have schools changed how happy are they to accept students who transfer in their senior year to enter the top 10%? Have they tried to stop that from happening?
So I only have anecdotal evidence that the policies are not to accept late-term transfers into the top 10% policy. Into the top 10% of a class. And it's just coming from the incumbents fighting against that. And so late-term transfers are giving up an option. And so if this kind of mobility is to pay off, it has to be early.
So has there been convergence in how you calculate the top 10%? You said there was variability on how schools determined what the top 10% was. Has there been also convergence in how they calculate that?
Well, why were you thinking there would be?
I figured that with this regulation that there might be some sort of
I haven't thought about that.
Converge the way you calculate the top 10%.
And that would make it more predictable, and therefore there could be
I see.
rational behavior.
Right.
Yeah.
I
I would think parent backlash would demand that there be.
Right, there would be some sort of
sensible,
legislative
logical-
pushback to say, we've got to have the exact same measure for 10%.
Well, at least anecdotally, there is a gaming of how you calculate top 10%.
There's 12% in the top 10%, I think.
By altering the definition of school. So some of these magnet programs that you're describing have more, the building has more than one school code. So they have one school code for the magnet program, and they have another school code for the non-magnet program at the same building.
And so we've heard them actually boosting, so that wouldn't help you with, it'd help you with the composition, but not getting more than 10%.
Well,
But I know
you
they're
have-
using cruder
Well, in your
ranking
school, you
measures so they can say there's 11
You
at
have
the
two
cutoff.
10%, two different 10%.
But it's still only going to be 10%
It
of
still will
the,
only be 10%, right.
Yeah.
But it prevents the housing of the magnet program from
being a problem.
From distorting. So in Austin, this was the practice, is that they actually had different school codes for the programs in the same building.
So you're saying that they sometimes round, so
Well, so
your
the-
11.6, you round up to, or your
well,
9.6, you round up to
the
10?
rankings are discrete.
Huh.
And so it is true that statewide, there's more than 10% in the top 10%. And so that's something the state's been...
So how do they do that?
Well, the state's been trying to, so that's where, like, to the extent that you're asking, has there been a backlash on the way they're doing this? The state's trying to, it seemed like that was gaming, that locally they were trying to push extra people in. And so that's where I've seen there be kind of a, not that there aren't, just that what I've heard about is on that dimension, having fewer people on the threshold, getting more refined ranking measures.
Did you show us what, if there were any changes in the demographics? I'm still not sure.
Oh, of the top 10%?
Who's admitted? No, not in the top 10%, but who's actually in the freshman class?
Yes, so I don't have data on that, but people have studied. Everything I was looking at was between 8th and 10th grade, so middle and
Right,
high school. But people who've studied the matriculation at college, it's actually not an easy picture to describe, because there are patterns in the applications that don't show up in matriculation. And so it's, you know, I could tell you a study about applications that says it seems that it has crowded out some minority applications, this whole policy. But for some reason, it hasn't crowded out minority matriculation. And so I've seen...
That was the whole purpose of the whole thing, as I understand it.
So the way people, this is what I was going to tell you before that I didn't get to, is that that minorities seem more responsive to applying if they're in the top 10%. So non-minorities' decision to apply doesn't seem to be affected by being in the top 10% of the class. So either they were going to already or not going to already, and this doesn't change the decision. Minority students who are in the top 10% of their class have been drawn into the application pool.
Like you see opportunity. Did you break that down, like African Americans versus Hispanics versus others?
Oh, do what?
Did you break that down?
Oh,
Like
so that...
minorities, African Americans versus Hispanics?
So for the application stuff?
Yeah.
So that's not my work. But they are breaking it down in all those detailed ways. But what I was trying to say is I've tried to digest it. And trying to digest it and tell you an answer, what has this done to minority representation, it's a hard answer. So it's not a clear picture. But it appears not, my takeaway from these two kind of competing things is it appears not to have had a big impact. And I think...
Changed, lowered, or increased minority representation in the freshman class.
Right.
Whatever the reason is.
Right. But yeah, I don't have a good underlying story for it. But as far as for our work, we have where we want to head now is breaking. Like when I look at these school choice decisions, so we can say, you know, how are minority students responding? Does it matter whether the schools, what the racial composition of the school is or not? How does that affect the likelihood of moving? So what we ultimately hope to do is be able to tell you what the effect of the policy has been on the composition of students in the top 10%. So, but we haven't gotten there yet. So all we can say so far is they look, there's responsiveness across all race ethnicity groups.
I mean, this is probably, you'll have the same answer, but I don't know if you would know, but I mean, so has this reduced the quality of people attending Texas institutions of higher learning? I mean, instead of affirmative action for minorities, it sounds like affirmative action for under...
So there's no doubt about that the quality of the entering pool at UT Austin is going down. Remediation is going up. And so I don't think on that there's much debate. And so that's why there's been, where the public backlash has been kind of with respect to UT Austin. That it's clear that it is now Early on, it was not affecting the merit-based admission system. Now it is.
But
So
is it going to hurt their football program?
that's the important thing.
No, I don't know, but that's what matters to us here. But there's a question here in the
Yeah, sorry.
I wondered, because the competition has gotten so stiff with getting into the flagship institutions in Texas, are the high schools adapting how to make their students look more competitive to institutions out of the state?
Like Arkansas?
We draw a lot of students, and they
Yeah, I
do
just
some
heard that.
pretty wild things with their transcripts.
Oh.
So I'm just wondering, you may not have any idea, but I almost wonder, if I was, principal at a high school and I was saying, okay, my 11th percentile students are out of luck, what can I do for them?
And that's one thing
I would create, a really crazy weighted GPA system to make them look very fantastic compared to students from other schools.
Yes, I don't have any of the facts on that, but the what would be interesting to know, and I don't know, is how nearby public institutions compare to the UT system. So it's pretty true that there's a big drop-off after the flagships. And so I imagine then public institutions in nearby states would look really attractive.
Like us.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
A follow-up to Jay's football question. Most high schools in most states place heavy restrictions on transferring from one school to another. Did Texas do anything with that? Meaning, in Arkansas, for example, if you transfer from one high school to another, you sit out for 365 days in every activity, band, choir, chorus, football, doesn't matter. How did Texas handle that?
I have never heard of that.
It might have a heavy impact on who would choose to transfer and who wouldn't.
Yeah, but how many football players are in the top 10%?
Yeah.
Or band or choir.
Well, that's
It has. I was wondering whether.
Loudly, Bill. I mean, some of them are in our college.
I was wondering whether there's the same flexibility in choice as there is in Texas. So whether it's likely that Texas has these restrictions as well. So I know where I live that we don't have that kind of thing. You transfer and you're immediately eligible for.
I think that's the same in Texas. I think you're eligible if you transfer.
That you're eligible.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, but I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, remember you.
I'm curious about how the universities, now the flagship universities, are able to reach minority communities. There are some distance education programs where professors are actually sent into certain communities. I'm wondering how that might skew the data one way or another.
Do you mean the recruitment efforts, or?
No, but offer classes out in minority communities where one would expect that the people participating are from those communities.
So, rather than actually going, so you think there's people who are getting the same education but not going to not actually enrolling or matriculating at the university?
Well, no, they are matriculated.
They are.
But in a different sense. I don't.
So maybe you go to UT Austin's distance ed college, something like that. Do they have something outside of the 10%?
Program down in Ellis,
Not that I know.
They offer a program down in Ellis, Texas, and fly the professors out there.
Right.
Every other weekend.
Yeah.
So where does that fit into the equation?
You still have to be admitted, though. Is that right, or?
But there can be special admissions, like we have our global school for community continuing education and academic outreach admits people from other states besides Arkansas and some of the rural areas.
Yeah, so I think as far as relative to what we're doing, it's just say that we're measuring one aspect of the incentive, and it's going to be noisy because there are all these other ways of getting in as well.
Let's just take two more questions here. I think Sandy and Bob, and then
I just wanted to point out, when I was teaching at James Madison in the 80s in Virginia, JMU, like a lot of Virginia State colleges, had the practice of taking the top 10% from all over the state, even though realistically the best prepared kids were from Fairfax County. For the simple reason, as one administrator told me, there are state senators from every county in Virginia, and they're voting on our budget. And I think it's a very logical, reasonable thing to say. Is there any evidence that in that 5 to 15% range, kids are changing what courses they take to increase their chances of moving on?
So I think, to me, that's one of the really interesting direct effects. So like as I said, we're looking at kind of an unintended consequence. I think one of the direct effects is what has it done to high school curricula. And there is evidence that high schools are offering so more high schools are offering AP courses. And so it's having an effect at least at that level.
Because the AP courses have super GPA points that allow you to leap into the top 10% more easily. An A is worth more in an AP than it is in a regular course.
In some schools.
Depending on how the school does it.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
But we're talking grades, not, you were talking test scores, not grades.
No,
So that would,
no, the ranking, so in the real policy, it's your class rank. So it's your grades. In the data that I have, I only have test scores, so I tried to show you that test scores are indicative of how someone places within their school. And so we were using test scores to predict where people are likely to place within their classes. So it is based on GPA. And each district decides how it's going to calculate GPA.
and that's why there's more than 12%. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, and I gather this would not be in your database in any way. If there are high-achieving Texas students who are not getting into the two flagship universities, instead of coming to Oklahoma, Arkansas, they could be going to the other Texas universities. Are there increases in their ability levels for freshmen, honors courses being developed, and so on? Because it would seem that these kids might just as well go to another Texas university, and that they would now benefit from having a higher number of higher.
So they also have the top 10% rule, so it's hard to argue where the crowd out of the able students would stop. But so unfortunately, most of my expertise is on elementary and secondary, so I kind of leave off being able to tell you true things when we leave high school. But that would be interesting to look at, is how has it affected the composition across all the schools. The focus has been on, because most of those in the top 10% across the state that are affected by this policy are going to UT Austin, Texas A&M. So the focus is on what's happening at those two universities. But that'd be interesting to know the spillovers to other places.
An exceptional last question.
You said this is grade point then. 10% grade point.
That's the policy.
It's class rank.
Class rank. So are special needs students put in with this special ed people? Do they have their grades point reported as a GPA? And are they in that class rank?
They're supposed to be.
They're supposed to be in the class rank. Now we know who to recruit.
Right, or they might create a separate school and have their own school code within the building. Who knows? But I want to thank Julie Cullen for coming here, and thanks to all of you.
Thanks for your comments. Thanks so much.
We now know how to assist rural schools in Arkansas. We just need to create a top 1% rule and drive everyone out of the cities and towns into the hinterland, and that'll be a wonderful piece of social engineering. So thanks very much.
Well, I mean, you could push down but it induces too much gaming. Too much gaming. What do you find? I'm sure the goal is not. They're not a problem. And so this was, I'm sure that it was just I was going to say, this is a way to give everybody their account for every school scholarship. It's basically a scholarship. It allows you to and it should be great.
It was the top 10. Let's say instead of the top 10,
I agree.
Well,
feel very secure.
So they do actually serve as it's honestly for promotion rather than
I look back there.
so taking your effective principles and getting out of principles administration.
Well, no, we had
Thanks, Jay. I know.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Keep pushing us to do this. What is the innovation? And it should be the innovation. Think of being skills in the market.
Better food.
Higher good pretty well. And it's hard. That's how do you measure that?
You know, by the time we're taking college, you've got to have that figured out.
Right. Well, but that's not science. So just most of my stuff's not charged. Presidents. Moving more into this area. My 10% of the thing here coming out this spring. University. No, they did. Stanford and of course presidency, kind of judging Bush, she doesn't come out too well. And then I have all for public and most little things in charter schools, mostly Great Arizona Data Center, really drives charter school. Oh, it's the biggest way.
Anyway, so what
drives really. So we actually have a teacher data set. Agree, disagree, I don't feel I'm sure it's a great predictor of what charter schools pop up. If they don't like their, and I one year
talking about how I'm calculating teachers' parents.
Generally, if you're implicit as Machiavellian administrator, people leave their charter schools when they can't. Or a lot of people in there. They did, and which is a good thing. They did this come back to district personnel. So, yeah, that's kind of, and sometimes those teachers, they never send them. Some of the charters were started by former district school teachers, administrators, and parents. So, you know, yeah, so basically people who kind of want to do something different couldn't run the system, but that was so bad.
If no one else
there's disagreement. Yeah, that's
Well, I think the motto would be, you did well, you did well, don't worry about it.
But we just need to have a clear school,
There's variables. Systematically hiring people
did better than some of the top 10%. If we're going to take all these things into consideration.
The cliff quality of it is probably not wrong.
As long as he had 3 school members in his pocket, he can cover the other 2. Here's how he got those 3. What did you do? Just bought stuff. Yeah, so it's the next big thing we're going to in school is basically tendency schools.
I'm working to get, well,
Not as
so subject matter, I've got the job done. I'm working to get
kind of shapes and policies why they don't copy more effective policies. So it's like big.
I can only find a job.
But the merit thing sounds really interesting.
It does.
Do you have any papers out on them now?
I have a bad.
Okay.
I should.
You should really send it out this year.
Yeah, I will. I think hopefully in about a month we'll have this. I mean, again, this getting more complicated. Because I think what we're doing so far is
Yeah, I can look at it and make sure that.
there were actually identified.
I'm kind of stunned that merit actually works.
You've been making this argument to me recently. Julie just made the same argument over breakfast, that basically that's the reason why NCLB works. Is what you've said to me also.
That's what he was doing this project.
Right.
But your stuff is gaming stuff. People go, who has NCLB?
But your stuff is pre-NCLB, right? Pretty much.
Oh, the stuff here?
No, the principal stuff, but it doesn't matter.
You know what?
It just shows.
NCLB, like it was in Texas.
Yeah. Well, and it also shows how, despite no incentives, no meaningful consequences for anyone else in the school besides the principal, directly from NCLB, that it still works because the principal indirectly affects the life of everyone else.
Richard Ingersoll's book, Who Controls Teachers' Work.
I've heard of this, I haven't read it.
Principals have a lot of informal power, you know, your schedule, when you get the little grant, what kids are in your class, that's huge power.
And time
Principals
allocation,
can,
how much time to play.
right, principals can do everything to fire you. They
Right.
can't fire you, they can do everything else.
It's more restricted in some areas than others.
Depends how unionized the system is.
Yeah. New York, I think, has more
I know
contractual
in Texas,
restraints.
districts don't have to offer teachers.
Well, they don't.
In Texas?
Yeah.
That's it. So you should see something related to that. That'd be really interesting. Yeah. But I just want to mention, when I was at UT Austin, I had a senior thesis student who looked at the racial composition of the entering class, and he had looked at 3 years, got the admission department's data. It was actually quite a feat to get it from him. And what he had was the last year of affirmative action. Then there was the year when Hopwood struck it down, but top 10% was not in place. And then the next year, 10% was in place. Okay. His expectation was that there would be a relatively high number of minority students under affirmative action, that it would drop precipitously with Hopwood, and then it would come up partway with top 10%. So it turns out it was unchanged across all 3 years.
Is that right?
Did they actually implement Hopwood? I figured they got around it.
Something was off. Perhaps they considered race in admission anyway during that middle year. But basically it was flat. I mean, the other
flat. Which part of it? Admission rates or
the number and percentage of African American students in the entering freshman class.
Because I've seen stats on that claim that. Like, we're citing these stats where it's all the way out.
People used the law school, okay, which is highly selective and has very small enrollment. And people use the law school numbers.
Yeah, I've just seen so many different numbers.
The undergraduate freshman numbers, it did not change. It did change if you excluded what's called provisional acceptance. This is students who actually don't meet the formal qualifications for admission. But the university wants them anyway. What they do is they come in the summer prior to the freshman year and they take a boot camp, and then they whatever deficiency they had in their application is healed by surviving the summer boot camp. And if you exclude
that was smooth.
So there was it did not actually affect racial.
Did they get rid of the boot camp after?
No, they kept us all. Yeah, I mean basically they're just trying to maximize enrollment, so they figured out a mechanism for doing that. Yeah. Anyway, I thought his name was Bobby Kerr. It was a senior thesis.
You can think it's out.
It probably exists somewhere in the UT Austin library.